Brian, your podcast, Into the Impossible, and your work in general, you focus on the origin of space, time, and matter. Well, I mean, the podcast branches off into various directions, but your work focuses on this primarily. And I think the best place to start would be, how do you define space, time, and matter?
Yeah, why don't you give me an easy question like what happened before the Big Bang? I guess we will get
That's
into
still
that.
coming.
So, space, time, matter are sort of, psychological crutches that we humans use to understand how the world around us appears and what it means to make sense of the world. Really, first, begins with giving things names. So we call space, the region that we can access either by sight, by motion, the different points in the universe that are accessible to us. And space can be completely independent of matter or time. But in the last 100 years, we've discovered there are actually a deep interconnection between the properties of space and time and matter. And that at first it was realized by Einstein and Minkowski and many others that space and time were essentially unified together in what was later called space-time. And that is now, instead of only addressing a point by its three-dimensional coordinates, up, down, left, right, backwards, and forwards, or north, south, east, west, and up and down, we have to also specify the time at which an event occurs. But the other thing about the discoveries of the last 100 years is that neither space nor time are fundamental or independent or even independently definable, in that they're malleable, they change, and they depend on motion. So space, if you think about space and time separately, you can do so as long as there's no motion or matter. But once you bring in motion, what is motion? What is speed? It's how many miles or kilometers per hour, per second, per light years per hour. That's something is moving at. So you need a space and you need a time. So the thing that unifies them together is speed, velocity. And that was realized that if you have speed as sort of the interconnecting tissue between space and time, and you also have the fact that velocity is relative, that you in a car, or have you ever been on a subway or on a train, and right next to you is another train, and that train starts moving, or maybe you start moving, and you cannot tell the difference.
Yeah.
Two uniform moving objects, neither one can say which one's moving and which one's stationary. Each one feels they're stationary, but neither one can. So therefore, if you link space and time together via velocity, and velocity is relative, that means space and time are both relative, and they can shift and change and warp. And that's true in the absence of matter. And when you add in matter, all hell breaks loose, because now matter affects how space-time connections are related to one another. So to get to a point in the distant universe, you now have to take into account matter, because matter warps and changes trajectories of beams of light, of rockets, of astronauts floating around. So it's insufficient to just have one or the other. You need to actually have all three of those together. And they're woven together in intimate and highly predictive fashion. Now lately there's been an incredible resurgence in the kind of memosphere on X and Instagram of everything is up for debate. The moon landing never happened. There's no such thing as an atom. Atoms are just vibrations of sound, and sound has all these properties and all sorts of true nutty pseudoscientific.
Periodic table can have bisexual tones.
That's right. Yes. So in that sense, we have to be very careful in that we need to be precise as scientists and specify when something sounds weird. It's not this, two things that sound weird are not the same. The fact that if you're in a, car, driving at a fraction of the speed of light, that actually you get shorter and compressed relative to an external observer, that's a fact that's verifiable. There's evidence for it. It sounds crazy because it doesn't comport with our everyday knowledge. And if you say if an atom has a tone and everything's made of silicone, which is not even an atom. But if you say that everything is just a harmonic of an atom called silicon or carbon, or you also are speaking something that sounds weird, and that's because it's utter nonsense and BS.
Mm.
So we have to be careful, and these things sound weird, and you always have to ask, what is the foundational bedrock truth that can give us information that we can trust? Not rely on an expert or whatever, but rely on evidence. And that's where my branch of science comes in. It's
Mm.
experimental physics. I'm not a theorist. I'm not coming up with multidimensional wormholes to teleport to planet Zorklon 16. I am measuring the universe, collecting data from the earliest photons that ever existed to be produced to travel to my telescopes and use that to transfer knowledge about every single thing they encountered in their nearly 14 billion year long life.
I often think about when I was a child, how badly I wanted to be an astrophysicist. And this stuck with me all my life. I've loved mathematics and physics so much. I mean, to a point where, Brian, literally on my chest, I don't know if you remember Carl Sagan's Voyager 1, the golden record. It's got the dive.
Not only do I remember it, I talked to his widow, Ann Druyan. She recorded her brainwaves a week after she fell in love with him, and they put that on that disc that I'm guessing is somewhere attached to your body.
I literally took the same image of the pulsar map. I've got a sun at the center of my chest tattooed with the pulsar map at the center. That's how much I loved that. It's so
that's great. Like
solar system
tattooing your address in case an alien comes by and picks you up, which is also in the news lately, right?
But it's pretty incredible story because I did that. I remember at the time thinking, born from stars, fed by a star. The sun's literally our life force. This is such a cool story, but people don't talk about it with the awe and this sort of poetic nature that the story really has. And you sort of filling that void that seemed to be missing for a little bit. I felt like we had those people around, the theorists, your Neil deGrasse Tysons, all the people, the Lawrence Krausses, the guys who come out, talk about these, make it pretty cool. And an experimentalist suddenly shows up and now is starting to dominate this public sphere. As an experimentalist, how do you take certain theories and which theories do you give the most credence to when you're trying to approach certain topics? What is the criteria you're using to make this search more plausible for yourself?
My hero is Galileo Galilei, who is really credited, quite rightly so, with the foundational application of the scientific method in history. There are others that came up with different ideas about it, but he was the first person to use evidence, in his case, evidence collected from a telescope, to justify and prove hypotheses about the universe. He also did experiments on gravity, famously dropping objects of different masses off of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and seeing which one hit the ground first. And those are revolutionary because it was just accepted that these experts from 2,000 years ago were such geniuses about logic and geometry that, of course, they knew about physics too, even though it's not possible to really find something that Aristotle did that was actually literally factually correct. But anyway, he was a brilliant man, and he was also canonized as a saint, which is quite interesting. But in terms of what Galileo did, is he revolutionized the empiricism protocols. So how do you go about justifying, validating what is true? He did that in a book, his second to last book, called The Dialogue. The Dialogo, which was a comparison between the two different world systems, the Greek one and the Copernican system. But that was really based on his observations from 30 years earlier in the Starry Messenger, where he saw that Jupiter had these 4 stars, he called them, that went around it, but he knew that they were moons. And so it was not possible anymore for the Earth to be the center of the solar system, which was the whole universe. So he really revolutionized the entire cosmos at that time. He said, well, it may be that there are multiple centers, but there's no such thing as Earth being the center of the universe. And that gave credence. He also made mistakes because he said that the Earth goes around the sun, and he could prove that by the tides on the Earth, which is not true. But leaving that aside, he did the first scientific application of data collection to prove a hypothesis. His lesser known book is called The Sagittori, which means the sagacious one, or it means we translate it now to be called the assayer. So what is an assayer? An assayer is a individual, a scientist, who's tasked with falsifying the claims of alchemists. The alchemist would take something made of metal and they would rub it on, the assayer would rub it on a piece of material called a touchstone. And the way that it rubbed off would illuminate if it was really gold or lead or was painted or what have you. So you could actually prove by using something that is intrinsically almost worthless, like a slab of rock has almost no value, by rubbing onto it an object that purported to be gold, you could actually prove that it was gold and therefore have a very high value of a piece of rock. It's just a different type of rock. And so that process is the one I try to apply. I don't have any special theoretical abilities, mathematical abilities. I can only do the following. I can only ascertain what is possible to measure. And then in using the knowledge of what's possible to measure about the early universe, use that fact and use those potential experiments, design in my mind and in reality with my colleagues, an experiment to test these theories of everything and the claims by theorists, which are easy to produce. It's easy to produce a theory. It doesn't mean that they're simpletons. They're smarter than me in most cases. But it's easy to produce a theory, especially one that can't be tested. If you say, I need a particle accelerator the size of the solar system or the galaxy in order to prove that I'm right, and I get 10 emails a day from people that have solved the theory of everything, that pi is a rational number, and it's related to the electron's charge, and all you need is a particle accelerator the size of the Earth's orbit. So all these things are nonsensical, but they're worse than nonsensical because you can't test them. You can't prove them wrong because there's no experiment you could conceive of to do it. So I'd like to not waste my time. And we only have a finite time on Earth when our minds and our bodies are connected, right? And so I want to apply those as much as possible to practical, pragmatic exploration of what we can measure. So that's what I do. I try to prove people wrong, not prove people right.
Since starting Into the Impossible, do you feel that certain views that you held very strongly have changed over time? Because for me, when I started this podcast, exploring different theories of consciousness, trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality, talking to all these experts, we've had many guests that are very similar, a lot of parallels. It really has changed my views, which is pretty crazy. Because coming in, I had such firm beliefs. Do you feel this has impacted you in a similar way since starting yours?
It has, but more so by sort of teaching me the kind of skills and motivations that I need to examine in myself. That it's impossible not to have preconceived notions or ideas or theories, but to sort of be cognizant of them and be aware that it's very tempting to follow a trend or want to be in on a phenomenon or get the early jump on something. It's also tempting to want to be a contrarian and a pessimist. There are people that only are pessimists, and so for me, the hardest part has been learning from the greatest scientists alive, 19 Nobel Prize winners, 4 Pulitzer Prize winner authors, to astronauts, billionaires, etc. That the truly exceptional minds balance the traits of confidence and humility. And there are some that are purely egoic and chutzpahdic, and they just really have a self-fulfillment that's unmatched, and some of them deserve it. Talking to someone who won the Nobel Prize, and he's pretty full of himself. That's you could sort of expect that. It's the highest accolade on earth. Bar none. There's nothing even close to it in terms of intellectual accomplishments. And so from that perspective, it's natural to expect that. But the surprising thing is I found very few of those types of people. Most people are extremely humble. They almost feel that serendipity, luck, played a huge role in it. And for doing that and looking at what these people want to tell their stories, mostly I have on authors. Occasionally I have on, just scientists, but they're also authors. Rarely will I have on just somebody who's neither, hasn't written anything, hasn't published anything scientifically, I have on, occasionally had people on that on, and they're interesting for other reasons. But the main thing is everyone has a story.
Yeah.
And the key thing I'm trying to do better is dig deeper into their stories and follow up in a deeper way, in a more meaningful way, engaging them more, almost, kind of doing something that great scientist named Oprah Winfrey does. She treats every person as if they're the most important person on earth. And it's hard over Zoom. I don't know where you are. Where are you located?
South Africa, Cape Town.
Oh, okay. I noticed the accent, but I never want to assume. I know that you guys have the best names in the world. I have someone named Bird. I know South, La Jolla, where UCSD is based, is a second home for South Africans. I have friends from Durban, all the way down to the Cape and beyond. So
I was
it's a real.
born in Johannesburg, but raised in Durban. But now I live in Cape Town.
Yeah. So, and I've never been. I was invited in 2020, right before the pandemic, and never made it. But I'll get there. I need to check it off because,
I'll definitely give you the VIP treatment.
and that will be good because an in-person podcast is just so much different. I've had the honor of being on with Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan and Tom Bilyeu and Jordan Peterson, and those are all in person. And there's a reason all those people and Oprah Winfrey. I've been on Oprah Winfrey, but Oprah, if you're listening to Tevin's podcast, please reach out to the both of us. We'll make a dynamic duo. But the point is, there's a connection element. It's very hard to do over an internet connection, no matter how fast. So you do a good job of it and you make people feel at home in it. But the main thing is, how do you demystify what scientists do and destigmatize? I always joke that, how do you know a scientist is outgoing? It's because he looks at your feet when he talks to you. So how do you kind of avoid that in a Zoom session? Well, it might be easier in a Zoom because you're looking at a camera, but I'm trying to bring that sort of humanization of my subjects and of the guests on the podcast to light. But the other thing, Tevin, that's really important to do, and I don't know how you feel about it, but maybe you'll let me know what you do. But quite frankly, have you ever been in a situation you're talking to somebody and they're just talking nonsense? Like, you just know they might be the most respected professor, and I know some of our guests are in common. I won't say who they are. I don't want you to say who they are. But have you ever had a guest that was talking and it was either the most advanced thing ever and you just couldn't possibly comprehend it, or they were promoting something, they had some ulterior motive, or perhaps they were just full of what? Have you had that experience? And if so, what did you do?
Look, so I just spoke about this last week to Kurt. Shout out to Kurt J. Mungle for all of those watching. Into the Impossible, Mind Body Solution, Theories of Everything, very similar podcasts. And we're talking about exactly this. I give them the platform, allow them to express themselves as openly as possible. Kurt actually called it a good interrogation technique, which it's true. You understand fundamentally that. Well, I personally believe that this person is fundamentally wrong, but I'm still open to listening. I want to hear more about it. And I think it's a tough one, because I find you're in this dilemma where we're in this postmodern world where relativism is a big problem. You have to worry about where do we draw the line with what we're willing to accept. And as someone who's a physicalist who grew up fundamentally, I love astrophysics, wanted to be a cosmologist specifically. It gets quite difficult when I hear theories of consciousness that go beyond this realm. The more I listen to some of them, I do give some more credence than others, but there are times where I think this person's just talking a whole lot of shit.
So, but I think we have an obligation when we talk to such people because, to push back. And that's been the hardest challenge for me because I don't want to be a schmuck. I don't want to be known as, well, you gotcha, because, for just obvious reasons, you don't want to, lose any kind of credibility or insight, to ever be removed from the list of people that, that reputation will get around, right? So from my perspective, I've tried to do it in a respectful way, but I'll push back by either asking questions. One thing that's really helped me a lot and may help you too is I always ask my audience on Dr. Brian Keating YouTube or Twitter or my website, briankeating.com, or Instagram. I always ask them to ask questions. And sometimes you'll get questions from the audience. Like I'm having an author on tomorrow, won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for discovering properties of RNA and ribosomes and stuff like that. And I might want to ask him, well, what do you think about this vaccine? And, how the messenger RNA went awry in some people and cases of injuries and stuff. But it might be uncomfortable for me to ask it. So instead, I might say, as is true, I have a lot of questions. How could you still stand by this technology that's led to, a million injuries attributed to vaccine? I can ask that in my audiences. Now, maybe that's a cop out. But on the other hand, if they're interested in it, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I've got 300,000 plus people across audio and video that listen or watch, and I always try to engage them. And a lot of times it's not for the gotcha questions. If I have on, a particle physicist, it's not like, oh, well, you guys, you opened up a black hole that swallowed up, all the Bria, all the bull tongue in the county of, I don't know where you are, which county it is. But anyway, the point being, astronomy, cosmology, fairly safe domains. Although I did have a situation once. I talked to an author. I won't say who it is, but it was a woman, and we're talking about life in the universe and and the cosmos, and she was very really into finding life on other planets. And I said, just out of curiosity, if you found life on another planet and it was the form of like an embryo or a fetus, a human fetus had been placed there, and that was the life that was there, how would you feel about aborting that life? And, oh, I'd be really against it. And I said, well, what do you think about abortion here on Earth? Oh, I'm really for it. So I kind of regretted that conversation because I was just seeing how intellectually honest or, she self-consistent she was perhaps. But I kind of regretted it afterwards. So you have to be careful. You don't want to take liberties with it, but you also don't want to let BS slide because there's this Brandolini's law that, the amount of effort to refute bull, BS is a magnitude or more harder to generate to refute it than it is to generate it. And so the world is filled with unrefuted BS.
Yeah, I think it's such a slippery slope. It's difficult to sort of it's almost an art to kind of get into this conversation with someone who you fundamentally disagree with and still leave that conversation feeling great, feeling like you were not disrespected, and it's something you have to sort of nurture over time. And I think because I grew up while I was studying medicine, I had a side job to help assist paying for med school fees, which was fortunate for me, which was television presenting, and I got to host a lot of people in South Africa on a television show, which made it easier to listen to certain people talk a whole load of random stuff about things that I had no interest in, and you still had to have this ability to engage the person, really make them feel like you're listening. And I do find it quite difficult. I don't know how you handle it, but sometimes when you want to push back, you really don't want to do it in a disrespectful way. By the way, I love the fact that you're wearing pink today and I'm wearing blue because our podcasts, the colors really go well with our podcast shows. So
That's right.
Great.
Totally authentic.
You sometimes record an episode with someone and then you leave that conversation just thinking, I wish I didn't really do this episode. It's sort of it's one of those conversations that I'm contemplating not posting.
Yeah, I've never not posted something. I've had my conversations with other people not posted, but and I don't really know why because it was multiple. I'd been on multiple times, and then the last time he didn't post it. But I've never not posted anything. I've come away feeling like I took that interview because the guest at the time, when my podcast was really small, I had 1,000 subscribers to it. This name guest, he's got 180,000 followers on Twitter or Instagram, and but I haven't necessarily felt that was the greatest reason to have them on. I mean, it was sort of, maybe it's tangentially related, like I'll have someone on who's making synthetic cheese, that doesn't it's vegan but it tastes good, or let's say I had on somebody, I didn't, but I did have something similar, but at the end, I was like, well, it's kind of like science, and maybe it's not. Or I had on this woman who wrote a great book about Instagram, the story behind Instagram. And I thought it would be kind of like The Social Network, where she's going to blow up, get all this attention, and I get all this attention for being, the one who interviewed her. And it was fine. She was smart, but it had no appeal to my audience, and nobody watched it. But again, that anything went during COVID, so you'd almost like I was just so excited to talk to somebody other than the barista at Starbucks or something like that. But yeah, oftentimes I wasted a lot of time because I do the hardest thing for me to do in the podcast is read every book. I don't like to not read the books. And so a lot of times I might have on somebody that has written a huge book. They don't have an audiobook, so I can't listen at 3 times speed. And then I'll only read the first and middle and last chapter or something like that. I've only done this 3 or 4 times. But I kind of felt a little bit low integrity for doing that until I listened to a podcast by this guy, Chris Williamson, who's become extremely popular. I was on his show in 2018 before he had video. Now he's got 2 million subscribers, and back then he had 200 or something. And didn't even have video. And then later on, when he became super famous, popular, went on Rogan many times, and he gave good advice because he said, my job is not to be audible summary. My job is not to be the book short form, which is the company that I use, but it's to create an atmosphere, vibe, he called it, for the listener to enjoy and have a conversation, not to make buying the book superfluous, which the authors will always love. I mean, I love to talk about my books. Last night I talked to a Korean radio station about my second book. It's called Into the Impossible.
Awesome.
And it's been translated into Korean and it has the weirdest name. It's called Physicists Don't Trust Their Brains. That's the translation. I don't know how they would get that. I wonder what it'd be in Afrikaans. Maybe you can help me out. But anyway, the point is that I want to talk about it, and it was very tight. She asked me to summarize it, and I didn't really summarize. I summarized the themes of it, but it's always fun to talk. I just don't like to go into an interview where I haven't fully done the research, and to do that, you need 2 or 3 hours per. I mean, these people have spent thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours developing the skills and tools to write a book or to become a Nobel Prize winner or what have you. So, the least I feel I can do is 2 or 3 hours. So I can't just show up the way that I'm convinced Joe Rogan doesn't read any books, even the ones he's authored the forward to. So, I just showed up. He didn't read it. He watched my podcast, but he didn't read the book. So that's the difference, I think between this and what I try to do.
I completely agree. I think that's the most exhausting part. I was just chatting about it the other day, thinking about how much time goes into preparing for each podcast. I mean, reading Losing the Nobel Prize, reading Into the Impossible, reading every book that goes into making these podcasts, but then also trying not to do what you're talking about, just being this auto-generated questioner. Because then AI could easily do that. And that's not what I want for the listeners of Mind Body Solution. That's not what I want at all. I know Into the Impossible is premised on, is based on your love for science fiction. And I'd love to explore that a little bit. Let's talk about that. I mean, the Into the Impossible, Arthur C. Clarke. Give us some insight into that.
Yeah, so I actually became the associate director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, which we host here at UC San Diego. And because of that, we had a great deal of incredible luminary intellects that would come through UCSD. And some of them were writers, some of them were scientists, some of them were artists, poets, what have you. But they all shared the same common trait, which is that they were passionately curious about the universe and were interested in exploring it. Many of them were interested in science fiction. I actually have more of a love for science nonfiction than science fiction, although I can indulge science fiction at times if it's done well. I did come to science via Isaac Asimov, not his science fiction, but his science nonfiction books on chemistry and so forth. And you may know that Arthur C. Clarke himself was also a great writer of nonfiction and science and popularized things like virtual reality, FaceTime, geosynchronous orbits of satellites. And without him, we wouldn't have at least the name of what we do, podcast. So the podcast comes from the sign behind me, if you're watching. and it says open the pod bay doors, and that's a quote from Dave, the astronaut scientist in 2001 A Space Odyssey, when he tries to get back into the ship that's going to Saturn, because of this life form that's discovered there, and Hal won't let him in, and so there's this battle there, and the pod was this life support system that contained all of Dave's needs that allowed him to live for a while longer before he does this big maneuver and tries to get back in. I won't spoil it, although it's 55 years old, so can't really spoil it at
One of
this
the
point.
greatest of all time.
Yeah, and it's just and so much so that Kubrick is accused of being the person who staged the moon landings and the falsification of the moon landings that many people believe is the case, that we never went to the moon. It was just shot in a movie studio in Hollywood. And the reason that the flag is waving on the moon, according to Bart Sibrel, who was on the Joe Rogan Experience recently, and I made a video debunking it. But according to Bart, this conspiracy theorist, the flag is waving because there was wind in the studio. So Kubrick was this master, creative genius, but he forgot to close the door inside of the studio to replicate the moon landing, along with these electrical lights that Bart loves to talk about. So anyway, the point being, when the pod bay doors referenced, then became synonymous with the life-saving, life-sustaining notion of the what was then called the iPod back in 2001. When the iPod was being developed, this guy Vince, who's an engineer and product branding person, he suggested to Steve Jobs that it would be called the iPod based on the pod in 2001. So we have the podcast name only because of Arthur C. Clarke. So that's one of the many reasons I do love him and the work that he did.
Aside from Arthur C. Clarke, Brian, what other science fiction? I mean, we'll focus on nonfiction in a bit. What other science fiction do you enjoy? Any specific authors or books?
Yeah, and I'm very blessed to have had on, 2 or 3 of them, David Brin and Stan Robinson, Kim Stanley Robinson, who are both alumni of UCSD, that have written just incredible books and very different from the type of science that I do. But the one in particular that really resonates with me in recent science, fiction history is sort of fan fiction about Galileo called Galileo's Dream by Kim Stanley Robinson. And it's just the most phenomenal. It's got so much science fact in it. And the audiobook is just phenomenal. And so I did an event with him and Mario Biaggioli here at UCSD on what would have been Galileo's, 500th birthday, I think it was. It was the 400th anniversary of the telescope. So he couldn't have been 500. But anyway, the discussion of, between the 3 of us, a historian of science of Galileo, a writer of Galileo's work, and then, someone who builds telescopes based on Galileo's design. That's really the one that ranks up most closely for me.
You just mentioned historian, right? And the first thing I thought at the moment was people could look at you and think that he's a historian because you're literally studying history. When people think of history, they're thinking World War II. They're thinking about all these exciting moments in human history. And we tend to forget that the universe has a history of its own. And we were firmly not a part of it for a very long time. I mean, second of the last day, I can't remember the exact amount, but talk to me about the story of the universe, because it's an awe-inspiring story. There's 2 particular cosmology stories that I really loved. And I remember the one being the Hubble ultrafield, the deep field. That moment expanding this universe so much more. And the CMB. And that's particularly focused on your work. Those 2 images are 2 of my favorite, possibly 2 of my favorites when it comes to thinking about the universe, the cosmos, just based on the historic significance they come with. So tell me about this story.
Yeah, so those 2 images, I call each one in different occasions, I call each one, kind of cosmic wallpaper or cosmic screensavers, because in one case, all the processes that we know about in the universe come from fossils. We cannot do an experiment as an astronomer. I cannot change the temperature of the sun and see, does that make the sunspots more intense or less intense, and so forth. I can't do an experiment. But there's literally 100 billion other sun-like stars in our own galaxy. Mm-hmm. So statistically, we can do an incredible job, maybe not doing an exact experiment, but God or Mother Nature, if you will, is kind of doing this experiment for us, having millions of variables under the control. And we can look at that and see what is the effect of, different phenomena. But in cosmology, there's only one universe for now. There are a lot of claims we could live in a multiverse. There's zero evidence that we live in a multiverse. So that has to be taken into account. But in a universe that only has a single instance of our universe, or what we can observe, we are observing effectively different kinds of what I call fusion processes. And the most familiar to you might be the fusion itself of the light elements on the periodic table, where they came from protons and neutrons fused together to make heavier elements. And then those proton-neutron nuclei, it's called deuterium, then they fuse to make helium. And we see the leftover remnants in the universe of hydrogen and helium, and those can only have come from the Big Bang, what we see in the universe. In fact, we can scoop up some in the ocean here, there, and we will get we'll get some measurement of the abundance of tracing back to the original composition of the universe the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang. Mm-hmm. But there are other fusion events that took place as well. There's a fusion. So after the first nuclei form, it took 400,000 years for the universe to cool off enough to fuse the first atoms. The first atoms were hydrogen atoms. So hydrogen nuclei is just a proton. A hydrogen atom is a proton and an electron. But the universe was too hot until about 400,000 years after the Big Bang for the electron to stay bound to or fused to the proton in an atom. So that took 400,000 years. When that happens, the CMB is produced. Mm-hmm. That leftover heat at the time of the fusion of the first atoms is called the cosmic microwave background. That's what I study. And then if you like, 100 million years go by until the first stars in the universe start igniting, fusing together their hydrogen into helium, providing heat, and they accumulate and fuse together into galaxies and clusters of galaxies. And that process is sort of the last major fusion of material in the universe. In that sense, you're fusing a galaxy made up of individual stars. And that is the Hubble deep field. So that occurs at a much earlier, much later time in the universe's history, which is much closer to us today. And by using a telescope is a time machine. So we may not be able to do an experiment like a biologist can take a fruit fly and change a chromosome and see what happens to it, because we only have one universe, but we can use a telescope to go back in time and see what were the physical conditions like at those extremely early times. And one of those times we can go back, the first one going back from Earth to the past, is the Hubble deep field, now been replaced by the James Webb ultra deep field, seeing very consistent things, but also bringing up new questions. Why are the galaxies so mature? Why are there so many of them? Why are they so hot, bright, luminous? This should be impossible, according to some, like some of my guests and some that I don't have on my show. But this should be impossible according to the standard Big Bang theory, because there's not enough time to form a giant galaxy to produce that luminosity at a redshift of 10, which is where we're seeing things just 400 million years after the Big Bang, so 1,000 times later than the CMB. And then the CMB is a tracer of the processes at the time at which it was created, 400,000 years after the Big Bang. So you have a factor of 3 orders of magnitude between these two events. And so they're going to reveal extremely different phenomena. And yes, you're right. They're iconic images. They really are the pinnacle of cosmological observations that human beings can measure, in the sense that we can't really do any better. We literally can't do better than the CMB temperature maps. I have a beach ball in the side of my office here that has the depiction of what you'd see if you were God looking at our universe from the outside, so to speak. And that is the oldest light in the universe. You can't look at light, find light earlier than that. We hope to, on my experiment that I'm building with colleagues from 60 other universities, 300 other scientists, called the Simons Observatory, we hope to make another image, which would be an image of the gravitational radiation present not in the first 400 million years, not in the first 400,000 years, but in the first trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang. That's called inflation. So that would be another iconic image. We claimed to make that 10 years ago with BICEP. We had to retract that claim, and that was the subject of my first book, Losing the Nobel Prize, I have over here. Mm-hmm. So this book is the story of how we came to almost win the Nobel Prize, and then we lost it because we mistook the signal that we saw for a cosmic signal when it was really a collection of essentially chunks of microscopic space dust, similar to these meteorites, which I give away to all my beloved listeners and viewers who live in the United States that have a .edu email address. So put a link in the show notes, maybe to that, briankeating.com/edu. You'll ship you one of these if you live in the US. If you don't, sorry, I'll have to ship one to Tevin. He'll ship some to you from South Africa at his cost. But I love to do that. And I also give them away to normies that don't have .edu email addresses. I pick one or two at random at briankeating.com. So yeah, I love to give these things away, even though this is the villain of my book, Tevin.
Yeah,
this is a villain. This is what caused me and my colleagues not to win a Nobel Prize.
I love the fact that with your recent conversation with Lawrence Krauss, that someone asked you if there's any radioactivity in some of those. I found that very...
Yeah, that's right. Very little, yeah.
Very little. There's radioactivity everywhere, but it's minute. When I was speaking to Lawrence Krauss, I was thinking we were discussing, I mean, these alternate theories of reality and multiverses, dark energy, dark matter. What are your thoughts on these concepts? I mean, I've heard you talk about them. Where do you stand in terms of the fundamental nature of reality? How do you define this? In terms of the nature of reality, the understanding that I have is, again, a very pragmatic approach. I like to look for what is possible for me to measure, and not to prove, but to disprove. So there's many hypotheses that contend that the universe didn't have an inflationary origin, and therefore would not have a multiverse experience, sort of a multiverse. But the fact is, we can't rule out inflation. We can't disprove inflation because inflation could occur, but with so low an energy scale that it's undetectable for our instruments to view it, in which case we would perhaps say that there's no evidence for it, but it's true, it did truly happen. So you'd be ruling out the hypothesis, making a type 2 error, it's called. So, but there are other theories that suggest the universe is not a part of the multiverse. In fact, there's 3 or 4 different theories like that. And they go by different names, like a steady state universe, static universe, quasi-static universe, bouncing universe, conformal cyclic cosmology. And those all have a virtue that they can be falsified. We could prove them wrong with our instrument. That would not necessarily prove inflation, but in science, you can't prove a statement like 1 + 1 = 2. You can do that in math, although not according to Terrence Howard, but you can do it in mathematics for logical propositions, piano axioms, and go into deep mathematics of number theory and so forth. But you could prove it. It takes a long time to prove 1 + 1 = 2, but you can prove it, and just using the laws of predicate calculus and logic. But you can't prove a scientific statement. I can't prove the universe began with a Big Bang. I can have extreme evidence for it. I can rule out every other model that one could think of. But tomorrow somebody could come up with some other theory. Isaac Newton thought that gravity was transmitted at the speed of light. And at his time, he couldn't falsify that. Later on, it was disproven by, it was faster than the speed of light, infinitely fast, Newton thought. And it took Einstein to show, no, gravity travels at the speed of light as well. So for these reasons, I think it's important to look at what real scientists do. Is we don't go out, we're not trying to prove Brian Greene or Eric Weinstein or whoever, their personal theory. If they make a prediction, I try to press them all. What is a rigorous prediction that you can make from your theory? Not just that it's elegant or it's beautiful, as Brian Greene told me, or that you can get certain things out of it. That is the only theory that can produce things that we do see, like gravity and general relativity. That's not proving. It's not able to be disproven. It's just a nice feature of a set of mathematical equations. So when people say these things, I always say, well, what's the actual concrete prediction that I can measure in a telescope or a particle accelerator? If they say there is none, it may be interesting mathematically, but it's not in the realm of physics. And so I can't necessarily waste my time with it. I've noticed you've also had, similar guests on your show in terms of discussing consciousness at this point. I know you don't find free will to be very intriguing in the sense that nobody acts like they don't have free will. So what is the point in actually talking about it, especially as a pragmatist? I mean, there's no point in really discussing this. I mean, if you're a determinist who doesn't believe in free will, it's not like you're walking around naked on the streets doing whatever you want. But those people you've spoken to who fundamentally believe that reality is consciousness. I know you've spoken to Bernardo Kastrup recently. You've had several similar guests who've got these views. You've got people like Donald Hoffman, etc. How does someone who's so pragmatic, trying to figure out how we can use this physical universe as a tool to understand the nature of reality, then have these discussions with people who have such alternative views?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to listen to voices that have earned credibility to have standing to communicate with. In other words, people say, "Oh no, you should listen to everybody, and you'll be surprised. Terrence Howard will be right." He has zero standing. He has zero training, zero knowledge. He has made provable errors in logic and scientific knowledge, and mathematical reasoning and so forth. So no, I don't think. Sometimes I debate. Should such people be ridiculed, not celebrated or entertained or humored, but should they be humiliated? And I don't like to do that, so I'm not going to humiliate them. Other people that propose the moon landing, as a hoax and so forth, I will entertain those. I did tell Joe Rogan I would come on the show and debate him, and I don't think it would be close. Although there are all of his adherents that say, because I am a scientist, that I am suspect. I work for big NASA, that I just care about the narrative, and the government lied to us about COVID, and therefore they can lie about everything. So maybe even the world and the earth is flat, and it's very nonsensical. But again, Brandolini's law, the BS asymmetry principle applies. You cannot refute everything, because you'd be spending your life refuting 10 to 100,000 times more BS than there is actual real physics that we can attempt to entertain. So I have enough things to keep me busy, and an orthodox practicing scientist. But to say that we have to listen to these alternative models, theories, I think that's nonsensical. It's provably detrimental to listen to. At some point, everything could be regurgitated, right? So we could go back and say, well, there's phlogiston, and so that's why things combust, and there's phrenology is a good tool to use for diagnosing mental disorders, and the lobotomy was won a Nobel Prize, so we should do that more and more often. So at some point you have to realize that it's almost like a dark scientific age. It's not unique, fortunately or unfortunately. It's many times over. It's not unique. So I think that this is something that we just have to get used to. That there's always going to be conspiracy theories and crackpots and people that say woo-woo things that to a lay person might sound appealing, but even at very first blush, I mean, we could say, well, heavy things fall faster than lighter things, or well, since every atom has a resonant frequency, that means every note played in a Terrence Howard movie soundtrack is just creating atoms, because there's a duality between these two. And they would say, no, that's not what we mean. So they like to use science to kind of as a cudgel, as a battering ram to kind of attack science. And for that reason, I find it very abhorrent.
I mean, basically all Terrence did was take Walter Russell's model and try to sort of just defend it, I guess, in a sense. It's pretty crazy. I mean, I was watching Kurt and Lee Cronin, and you've spoken to both of them at the same time before discussing it. And I find it intriguing that we're spending so much time discussing this man's view. As you said, I mean, what has he really done to sort of justify or earn this spot to be an expert in that field? Because I agree with you. I mean, I tend to have most of my guests are either professors, PhDs, I mean, people who have thoroughly studied this, been tested on it, and passed. Because, I mean, that's a fundamental difference between someone just sitting at home, reading a book, and then figuring out a few things here and there, is that you're not really being tested afterwards. Did you have to really spend the hours putting in the work and the effort trying to fundamentally understand this concept? Do you think that's a big problem there and lacking from his side?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do. I mean, these are things that are, demonstrably false. There's zero evidence for it. It's like, looking at a picture of the snake that eats its tail and then saying, well, that is,
Ouroboros.
an Ouroboros, and that kind of looks like, this cosmology, and so there's no evidence. I mean, I'm looking at this, right now, and it's so laughable. I mean, there's stuff on here. Okay, so let's look at this now, or maybe I'll put this up when I edit my version or what have you. But it's got like 17 different elements. It's got like between just for hydrogen has like 20 beta non.
Mm.
Um, all
Just
these things. Okay, so he's making a prediction. So every single one of these predictions, the second octave, there's something called, between lithium and fluorine. He doesn't describe how they come about. He just puts numbers to them. There's luminon, there's helionon, there's carbogen, beta non. So he's made 1,000 predictions here that can be falsified, and in fact have been falsified. There's no mechanism for these things to form. He's not saying they don't exist. He's just saying that there's integrating light octave within another. So it's very appealing to people that want to see ridiculous patterns, or want to see sort of a joke about stuff. Whereas when you want to take your medicine, if you have a headache and you try to get some betanon to do it, or your pharmacist uses alchemy, or perhaps uses snake oil to do it, you say, oh no, I don't want to do that. I want to use actual proven medicine. Your child is going in for surgery. I don't know, Terrence Howard has a kid or something, and they're going to give him anesthesia, and the anesthesiologist says, I'm going to give you Betanon instead, because your ideas are so good, Terrence. I want your child, your daughter, your beautiful precious daughter, to have some Betanon. Breathe it in, because that will cause her to resonate. He would stop the doctor. He would call child protective service. He would go nuts. So it's just total nonsense. They don't believe any of this stuff.
well, my girlfriend's an anesthesiologist, and I'm a
Oh
doctor.
wow,
I'm just
good.
thinking about how irritated we get when when a patient wakes up and they're like, oh, thank God. I mean, we're just sitting there like, oh yeah, we were just there, just watching. I mean, it's we had
Wow.
nothing to do with it. we want some of that recognition. I mean, it's crazy. There's no way I'm going to give you some sort of a musical note as medicine. I mean, I'll definitely go to
Right.
something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, that is it's a big problem.
The problem comes in, I think, when someone has learned enough about a topic to know enough, but not enough to realize they don't know anything in that topic.
Hmm.
And that happens to me all the time. The more I learn about certain things in physics, for example, your work, the more I read about it, the more you realize, I mean, I know absolutely nothing to really go in depth and have a discussion with Brian Keating regarding the CMB, for example. I mean, I know enough to have a fun, friendly conversation. And I think that's where possibly Joe Rogan goes a bit awry, where we're starting to feel like he is an expert because he's now spoken to enough experts. And I think that's where a blurry line tends to occur. I mean, I've spoken to enough professors of mind at this point, but still never really going to consider myself the expert in the field. And I think that humility that they lack tends to be the biggest problem.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. To say that you can do the work of a scientist like me, or my colleagues, or my students who work for half a decade, and then they still don't have, the kind of judgment or wisdom. Science means knowledge in Latin. It doesn't mean wisdom. So
Mm.
how do you get wisdom from that? Well, I think it's important to look at the fact that science can't produce wisdom. Just having a set of facts, is not sufficient. Wikipedia has a lot of facts. If you were going to do that to consult with, and I'm just looking up Terrence Howard, and I looked up to see, does he have any children? He's been married 4 times to 3 women, and he has 5 children. Okay, well, Neil Armstrong got divorced too. I think he married his wife twice. I'm not going to judge him for that. But again, yeah, he's got a son. He's got multiple kids. He's got a granddaughter and a grandson. And for me to think about this person in terms of like, yes, is this appropriate for somebody to say such things? Again, to me, if you don't put in the work, it's not only that you are doing something, morally questionable, but you're also condemning people that have put in the work to do the
Mm.
real thing. It's like even this guy, Russell, and who Howard is quoting and trying to get a patent about. this person had, at least at some point, learned about what a spectrum is and learned about, spectroscopy and molecular, dynamics and stuff like that. And then, started to put a bunch of nonsense together. So my question is, to what extent do we as scientists allow for the disparagement of what we do? That if this guy can do it, between making films and getting married, to what extent do we have earned the credibility as scientists to push back and to say, look, you have done no real rigorous research. You have come up with some interesting numerical facts. I mean, it's like I'm saying, well, the number 6 is really important. Carbon is number 6 in the periodic table. And did you know, Tevin, that if you go out to the 900th decimal place of pi, that the number 6 repeats 6 times, and that's a message to us, and that means that pi is not real? I mean, at what point do you say, well, actually, we can discover how that came about, and we can, provide you with an expansion that actually is used to get pi to 1 billion decimal places. But no, you're not going to trust the people that came up with that, so that you found this supposed serendipitous coincidence. You're just gonna use the fact that other real scientists have come up with to attack science or to undermine the credibility in science.
Mm. I mean,
I find it very.
Never forget. Do not mistake correlation for causation. I think what's the most disappointing part about this whole thing is that Mendeleev, the way he figured out these things, I mean, each element and how certain things fit into place and how he set everything up, was such an awesome story. It was one of the coolest things that's been done. I mean, it was such an epic tale, the way he sort of figured these things out and how these patterns come together. And now for it to get sort of shut down and like pushed under the carpet, it's kind of irritating.
Yeah, it definitely is. And to, kind of, again, I call myself a practicing Jew. I'm not necessarily, a fully believing Jew, but I feel like belief is kind of presumptuous to say, oh, Brian Keating believes in God. So, I keep kosher, I can read Hebrew. I taught it to myself after age 30, which was very difficult. So I put in the work to do practice in this field so that I can have some expertise rather than just be like, again, past guest. I'm not going to poop on him too much, but, Sam Harris, who will condemn all religion, but he has a very superficial, almost, childlike understanding of the principles of at least my religion of Judaism, which, is the religion I think he's technically a part of or was a part of. Now he's obviously a prominent atheist. And that's fine. I'm not mandating that anyone should become, faithful to any religion. But when I talk to him about, some very basic concepts that have been adjudicated by, thousands and thousands of people much more knowledgeable than me or him, certainly about Judaism, to then have it pivot away from that and say, well, like, we can make a better Bible than God, and therefore God is irrelevant and non-existent, and the Bible is worthless because we wouldn't put slavery in there. And so I asked him, well, what did slavery mean? And we went into this whole discussion, and all of his fans, and how could you even entertain, this after 3.5 hours of talking, by the way. And then the conversation came to a more abrupt end. But, I do feel like we have this tendency to have this incredible arrogance about what we know, but we neglect the fact that we stand on the shoulders of thousands of years of giants. And I don't think that should ever be taken for granted.
And I think that's the biggest mistake, is that we, singular, I think we're so much dumber than we are as a unit. I mean, as a collective intelligence, we're much better. And what people tend to forget is that we're all working off each other's ideas. There's no singular Einsteins walking around here anymore. I mean, nowadays it's very difficult to come up. Well, there's so many people working on so many different things that it becomes almost easier to fall into this relativist trap, where because there's so many people doing so many different things, and because experts tend to have these views on science. Particularly, Brian, as you know, there's the realm of philosophy known as scientism. And I think that's where you get caught into this trap, of course, where people are calling you out and being like, that's scientism. Mm-hmm. You fall into this branch of people who do not fundamentally, who are not open to other sources of knowledge. And I often get caught out in the same thing. And yet we're still open to this discourse. I mean, you just spoke about the fact that you're not really you're not technically a believer, but you are practicing in a specific way. I mean, I often say I'm ontologically agnostic regarding the nature of the universe and God, but I would say epistemologically and knowledge-wise, I do consider myself to be sort of atheist, but 99.9%. I still leave room for it. I don't close it off. But you can never be 100% certain on anything. And
that's right. Yeah, no, I agree, and it's a form again of hubris, of chutzpah, arrogance, however you want to say it. That for thousands of years, people have debated this, the greatest minds in human history, and you or me, Brian Keating has somehow found this obvious example for it. Even people like Lawrence Krauss. I mean, again, I debated with him about it. He has his own objections. He's another Jew who's atheist, militant atheist, and to again, these people. Oftentimes they do a very cursory examination or maybe they're so precocious like Sam and Lawrence that by age 13 when they had their bar mitzvahs or whatever they realized this wasn't for them, and yet they're left then for the rest of their lives with their 13-year-old interpretation of these various facts about their religion, which may or may not have been provisional, wrong, misunderstood. I mean, if you went to if a 13-year-old came up to Lawrence Krauss, I asked him this and said, your book, A Universe from Nothing, is total garbage, and I know better, and I figured this out. And he'd be like, well, how old are you? Oh, I'm 13. He wouldn't even entertain the guy. I mean, go to graduate school, get a PhD, understand quantum field theory, understand the Friedman-Robertson-Walker metric and general relativity, and then we can have a discussion. But no, you don't have to do that when it comes to religion, because religion's easy and it's just based on taste, and you can't debate taste. So why even entertain such people? And I think there's a little bit of arrogance that goes with sort of those sorts of intellectual approaches or non-intellectual, anti-intellectual approaches to it, rather than engaging with it, because I think it's different for religion than even, the multiverse, because they would have to, presumably, if I could prove God existed to you, Tevin, you might change your behavior. You might act differently. Nobody's acting perfectly flawlessly, right? So you might, and it might not be my religion. What if it's some religion that we don't even contemplate, that we reject because it's I don't know, pantheistic or whatever. The point is, if you could find some logical refutation for it, then you'd be sort of a mental patient if you didn't follow the precepts of that religion. And so therefore you are encumbered, and there's a natural inclination for atheists, I found, to not want to entertain, maybe even be openly hostile, as I found Sam and Lawrence to be, building up over decades of resentment towards predominantly Christian fundamentalists, to give them their perspective and their due. But nevertheless, to rule out every aspect of religion, say everything about it's false, and not even entertain it as beneath them, I think that's not intellectual.
Yeah, I think people have to have that sort of. That's where this open discourse comes into play, and I don't want people to feel like you have to be professional. Let's say you have to have the PhD, you have to sort of be a professor, but you have to put in the work. That's right. I mean, you have to have some sort of a background foundation that's based in this realm. That's why starting the conversation with definitions, I know it was a tough one to just be like, what is space, time, and matter? It's important because you and I could be talking about completely different things and just go around in circles. It doesn't really matter. I mean, if you ask, Jordan Peterson, who is God? What is God? I mean, you'll get like 20 different answers. But you ask like someone like Sam Harris, who is God? And he'll say, no one, nothing. Right. Simple yes or no question for them.
Exactly.
When you started this podcast, Brian, did you feel that it would grow into this phenomenal podcast that it is today? Did you ever feel that it would reach these heights?
No, I don't think so. I mean, most podcasts end after 7 episodes or something like that. So I think I'm on 420 or something now. And that's not a coincidence, that number. I know Elon Musk likes that number, but I think that's literally what I'm on. So yeah, I think nobody really, can expect to have success because it's dependent on other people. And when you look at, sort of how many people have subscribed and watched, almost up to 50 million total downloads and views and listens. And it's incredibly gratifying to see it. It is also very slow, and I still feel like it's undersubscribed and it gets too little attention, not because of my brilliance, although that's a part no, but because of the guests that I'm getting. I mean, like you said, I mean, nobody's had on 19 Nobel Prize winners and had deep discussions where they involve the audience in the questions and don't shy away from it. I think we've got, I hired a production team a year ago almost to really up the audio, video quality, shorts, clips, background footage, edits and quality of it. And, I spend a lot of money on it. I don't get paid for it. The university doesn't give me a dime. They don't even, half the time want to know about it because I'll have on controversial people like Sam Harris or, Ben Shapiro, God forbid, I had on. Or Jordan Peterson. Yeah, so having, those the university might not be so positively disposed to, but whatever. They give me some license and liberty to do it. But really, I feel like it's sort of just beginning. It's hoping to ramp up and grow, not just for growth's sake, because that is dependent on an external metric that you can't control. Whereas the quality, improving it, constantly running experiments to see what works and what doesn't, and also talking with other audiences like yours will kind of be the thing that supercharges the attention. But when I talk to people that are very successful, have millions of subscribers, they'll always say, well, what is your podcast competing against? And I'll say, Tevin's or, Kurt, Jai Mungal, or Lex Friedman. They'll be like, no, you idiot. It's competing against like Mr. Beast. I'll give $100,000 if you can sit on top of the Burj Khalifa for 3 months.
Yeah.
It's competing with, my daughters love to watch, unboxing videos of like silly putty, it's just
Baby
whatever.
Shark videos, like the Baby Shark channel online.
Royalty Family. God, if I have to hear that theme song again, or at least it's not like Nastia anymore. That was a phase. So my boys aren't it. They just want to watch, that Cybertruck and this thing and that thing. So I guess the point is, you can't really expect it. You can't also influence it. It's almost impossible to grow it. There's no other way to do it than word of mouth and kind of every now and then they'll have some viral, kind of semi-viral video. But even, the thing I'm most worried about is kind of audience capture. And I'm glad to see that our friend Kurt has kind of done less in the way of aliens and conversations with, Lou Elizondo, and I'm sure he will continue to have such conversations. But for a while, it was all he was doing.
Yeah.
And even he and I did a joint episode together with Tom DeLonge, the Blink 182 fame and this To the Stars Academy. And I felt, a little gross after that, but but with Kurt's help, we made it through. So you have to worry about
we had a chat about that, and
oh yeah, what did he say?
Yeah, but he was. I mean, he has calmed down on it. But I think he when he finds interest in it, he will go back into it. And I think I'm a little bit. I mean, my girlfriend made this cup for me just for the logo of mine, but she also added, like, just to highlight my love for space. She added a little bit of that. But I mean,
yeah.
I mean, Avi Loeb was probably the only person I spoke to who's been on the podcast who fundamentally believes it. I know you've also spoken to him about it, his scientific search. At most, I think that if we do find something, it would be something akin to bacteria, some sort of a cellular basic life form, unless I'm completely wrong.
Yeah, I guess that's, you have to be open to that fact that you could be completely wrong. I don't believe that it's possible right now to say that there's any evidence for the existence of alien life, even bacteria. Simply there is no evidence for it. But then there's even greater claims of, the existence of extraterrestrial technology. So what do you do with those types of claims? I feel like as long as it's harmless, it's fine. I don't think that certain people can remain harmless. Like, I think, you could say, well, attacking the moon landing is harmless because, who's going to hurt Neil Armstrong? He's dead. But it's something different. It's undermining the credibility of an institution like NASA that really rubs me the wrong way, because we rely on that every time we get on we get on an airplane. It's been tested, despite the Boeings and so forth. But the fundamental technology of how airplane skin is attached to rivets and stuff like that, that's not Boeing. That was NASA. high altitude research, supersonic research, space travel, and say, well, no, these things are impossible because of the Van Allen belts, and just total non. Like, this guy's a cinematographer. He's made conspiracy movies. It's listed as his Wikipedia entry. He's a conspiracy theorist, and okay, well, that has I believe in a conspiracy, that the Soviet Union was going to invade, Poland, or whatever. Yes, okay, some conspiracies are true. So that proves all the more so I'm not using it as a pejorative, but that's simply what he does. And then to trust him as some expert on lighting, and studios and the history of 1960s, and he's like less than 60 years old himself. So he's 10 years old, 12 years old, doing a documentary research to falsify it back then. So it's just sort of nonsense, but it does irritate me. It rubs me the wrong way because it's undermining. There are very few things that people should agree upon. And I got a lot of pushback. Like, people say, oh, what's wrong with the Nobel Prize? It's just like harmless celebration of scientists. And we need more of that, right? Keating, you're a scientist. Yes, it is. But you should also say that everything can be reformed for the better. But these people aren't saying that. They're not saying, like, let's get rid of the fact that only 3 people can win a Nobel Prize, so more people can win it and share in the credit and share the love of science. So I'm advocating for ensuring the legacy of Alfred Nobel in my book, my first book. In part, mostly it's a memoir about being a cosmologist than anything else. But the fact is, if you say that, well, we shouldn't trust anything NASA says because it's the government, and the government lied to us about 9/11 or COVID or JFK, then I think we're in deep doo-doo, because there's no thing that should be more universally celebrated than something like NASA. It's contributing to the exploration of the universe, which is, people like Elon Musk and everybody say, oh, we have to get off this planet. Well, where are you going to go? If you don't trust in NASA and space exploration, which Elon Musk believes we can go through the Van Allen belts. Are you saying that you, Bart Sibrel, are smarter than not just Neil Armstrong, but than Elon Musk? I mean, it's ludicrous hubris.
Well, I still remember Daniel Dennett, rest in peace to him, someone I really wanted on this podcast, and I wish I could have him on the show. I'm sure you're familiar with Daniel Dennett. Brian, there's no need for me to.
Oh, I had him on. He was I did the final interview he ever did.
Oh, I see. So I'm so jealous. I mean, I'm so sad to think that I'm thinking of having him on my podcast.
No, I know.
Passed away. I mean, it's pretty sick, but he's really was the guy. He was the number one pick for, like, if I could have someone on this show, it was Daniel Dennett.
Yeah, I found him very charming, just delightful, not unafraid, very courageous. It was a incredible intellect, and I think, to think about what we could have had, in the past 10 years with people like Hitchens and Hawk and Dawkins, and it's just it's been an amazing time for many different subjects, but especially exciting for things that are coming up with our field and the podcast as well. And I'm really grateful that you had me on. I got to go to my own interview soon, so to have another guest on. But it's been such a blast to have this conversation with you. It's great to have. I hate it when they go on and the host just has not prepared anything and just has no. I know that people have done that. Larry King used to do that, but I really do salute everything you're doing.
No, I mean, I'm a huge fan. Thank you so much, Brian. My channel, when I look at it, whenever I look at my statistics, you're always there. I always see that bright pink logo right behind your face, and I think, like, everybody's watching our videos. Mutual fans, mutual respect. Love your show, love your podcast, and also love even more the work that you do as a cosmologist, as a physicist, and someone who experiments and proves theorists wrong. And I appreciate your work, man. Thank you so much.
Tevin, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day down there, and hope maybe we can visit and do a podcast in person. That's the final frontier.
It would be an absolute honor. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, my friend. Take care. Bye-bye.